We hope you enjoy this podcast. All our conversations are inspired by films we have selected to appear on SDG Vision. So go and take a look and be inspired by people and organisations who are making valuable contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals and making our world a better place for everybody to live. Now, sit back, enjoy, be inspired, and afterwards, go and take action.
Well, welcome Chris Connolly to the SDG Vision podcast. Terrific to have you. Hello.
Hello, and greetings from Hastings.
From Hastings. Well, you've given away where you are from, which is great, which was going to be my next question, which is terrific. Well, lovely to have you with us, and I really do appreciate it. Now, viewers may guess as we go along, but I've known Chris for a number of years now. And Chris, I was thinking about it today. It's about 40 years, which is quite extraordinary. We met at that sort of radical hotbed, the University of Essex, in the early to mid 80s, and it's been a long relationship. So some may be surprised. I even surprised myself that I invited you onto the channel. But we'll discover why. Now, Chris is a man of many parts. I mean, he's a Renaissance man almost, I would say, a man for all seasons. He's an intellectual, a community activist, a journalist, a community journalist for the Hastings Online Times. Is it, Chris?
Well, I do both. There are two papers here. So we have, being a modern town, we have the Online Times, which is a digital product. But I've just gone back, actually, to Hastings Independent Press, which still does a weekly print run, a fortnightly print run, rather. So over the 10 years that they've run, I've pretty much worked for both papers doing different things.
Smashing, and we may come on to that if you feel it's relevant at all. And I'll talk about what the relevance will be, the issue that we'll be discussing today. You're also, I know, a lover of the arts, and I would say a bon viveur as well. I think you like your food and your drink, and you enjoy the ambiance of social occasions. Many, many other things that I could say, but I won't because we are an all audience. We'll leave it be at that. But you said that you're in Hastings. And I want to come back to Hastings because it's, not only probably my favourite town in the UK, but it's an interesting place, and you've alluded to that as well. But I want to sort of go back a bit further in your time because I first became aware of your interest in community activism when I think you were living, was it Seven Kings in Ilford?
So in East London, outer East London.
Yeah. And I was quite surprised to hear by a mutual friend of ours that you were engaged in sort of community activities and work, because I'd never really associated you with it prior to that. And so I thought it would be interesting to sort of explore what made you, or what sort of prompted you to engage at a community level, and what was it that you were engaged with at that time, if you can remember that far back?
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is kind of going back, to the 90s now. So it's 30 years ago, actually. We talk about the 90s as if it's yesterday. And I guess the impulse, I think, to do community things was a reaction to a very disappointing period where I'd spent 4 years as a local politician, as an elected councillor, between 94 and 98. And it was a deeply unsatisfying experience, in the sense that I think most people who do that kind of thing, whatever their kind of rosette colour, have some aspiration to make the place in which they live better. They want to do good. And I kind of put my name forward in 1993 to stand in a local election in a ward I'd pretty much always lived in, expecting to lose, actually. It's one of those acts that is kind of superficially benign because you can feel the virtue of doing the right thing but have no responsibility to continue doing it. But it was that moment when, politics was shifting and there was a big swing. So I got kind of elected against my expectation, and actually had no idea really what I signed up for. So it was also a year where there was a change in the political colour of the borough I lived, which had been deeply blue and wasn't anymore. So I was catapulted from nowhere into a position where I was chair of a committee and I had budgets and all these kind of things. But I spent 4 years sitting in lots of rooms and doing lots of meetings and engaging the minutiae of local government, but I had a feeling that deep down, nothing really moved. What we were doing was playing a kind of party political game. I'm not a party political person by instinct. I'm not a tribalist. So I kind of gave up after one term, in part because I got a proper job, but also because the sheer amount of hours spent in pointless discussion, process-driven discussion, often futile kind of party political point scoring, kind of led to a sense of a slightly degraded experience. And my feeling was I could do things better on the outside rather than the in. I could actually kind of turn my gamekeeper experience and go poacher, as it were, so kind of reverse that. So I stood down, and I think it was when my kids were born and we just bought a house. It's that moment of kind of coming to some kind of maturity, whatever that means. And where I lived in East London, in Seven Kings, there was an opportunity to engage Agenda 21, which is a global initiative about creating sustainable communities. And the bit of town I lived in was one of the two pilot areas. So I kind of went along to a meeting very, very frustrated at the waste of my time over 4 years in this party political setup, but hopeful that this Agenda 21 in Seven Kings might be a more exciting and purposeful activity. And it was, actually. And it was, I think, one of those lucky moments. You go in a room and it was quite a large audience. There must have been 100 people to, well, more than that, possibly 150 people. The usual kind of suspects. There was a kind of predominantly older crowd. I was still very young. Now, of course, I'd be entirely typical of the people that do community, older men in jumpers and gilets. But at the time, I was a young buck, and that was different. But there was a kind of radical edge, and there was a kind of sense that the area we lived in was going through many changes, was perhaps slightly declining, that the quality of public provision was less good than it had been. We'd lost the public library a few years before. There was a sense that well-established shops were pulling out. There was the multiplication of HMOs in the area without compensating services. And the feeling was that this Agenda 21 thing, because it was a bit of a catch-all, was a great opportunity to address those issues in a more rounded way, a more holistic way. So I kind of signed up to be on the kind of inner group, the action group, to move it forward. And I got to know a set of people. A lot of these things are driven by social impulses, and the people were interesting and they were worth talking to, and it became interesting and quite critical. I think the questions we were asking were quite genuine questions about what makes a good community. So I totally agree with your opening statement. I'm not the kind of person that would have done this or seen myself as doing it. But having gone down one more formal route, the obvious route, you become a councillor, and found that lacking, I kind of reinvented the discussion and joined in this Agenda 21 activity, which led to the setting up of an independent community organisation in Seven Kings. And that was the gloriously named Seven Kings Action Group, SCAG. And actually, I think people quite like that acronym. It kind of pulled people in. But what we did over a number of years as a kind of independent group was certainly hold the politicians to account.
Well, that's an interesting perspective, Chris, I think, in terms of actually being actively engaged in politics at a local level, feeling dissatisfied with it, and then being engaged in community work. Well, what then happened? What led you to actually encounter work at the community level?
So I think the community work effectively came out that difficult experience as a councillor, and the opportunity that arose through living in Seven Kings in East London to be part of one of the two pilot projects involving Agenda 21 in the London Borough of Redbridge. So one was in a suburban kind of midpoint in the borough of Barkingside. The other was Seven Kings, which I think was probably chosen because it was at the poorer end of the borough, and also probably the most ethnically diverse end of the borough. So we had big Asian populations, we had a very big Irish population, yet there was still a kind of residual middle class. It kind of had all human life there. So I kind of pootled along to the opening meeting of the Agenda 21 group in Seven Kings, and there was an immediate buzz that marked it as being qualitatively different to the council experience, where there was no buzz ever. There was the quiet hum of nothingness. So I think what was also good was that there was a degree of anger, I think, from people, and that you had populations who'd been there for a long time, older residents who ostensibly would be quite conservative, saying, actually, we don't like this decline. We think that the area deserves supporting. And then you had new people who've moved in from often inner city or further out areas who saw Seven Kings as a kind of mobility experience, who were saying, well, actually, our experience isn't necessarily quite as rich as we thought it would be. So it's a great cocktail of people who didn't have a lot in common, bar the fact we lived in the same neighbourhood, and liked the fact that it was a quite quirky place to live. And that kind of tied me into a whole set of people I think I wouldn't have otherwise met. And at the point at which the council, who hosted Agenda 21, invited a group of us to kind of take the group forward independently, I put my hand up, and I'm not a joiner by instinct. So that was in itself a kind of an act of commitment that was rare. And over the next few years, what we did effectively was an awful lot of listening to people who lived in the area, and an awful lot of listening to people who might not agree with you. I think it's actually really healthy to do that. And from that, we began to kind of develop, I guess, an alternative manifesto for what might make a good community. And hopefully, we didn't just do the NIMBY stuff, although we did pick up on dumping and the hygiene factors that community groups often get caught up on. But what we also tried to do was bring investment to the borough and a sense of confidence on the part of the local authority when it talked about places like Seven Kings. I think you can often get that dialogue from often quite well-meaning public authorities, where you get that slight condescension when people talk about poor places, or what are perceived to be poor places. But actually, there was a lot of social capital, there was a lot of richness there, and I think what we wanted to do was to mirror our confidence in the place, and to see that evident in the town hall. So we got a shop. I mean, one of the first things we did, we set up as an independent group, Seven Kings Action Group. We managed to get hold of a kind of former antique shop that had been closed for a while, and that became a community shop, which ran for a number of years, actually. And a whole set of stuff went in there from the meetings that we ran. But more important than that, there were kind of friendship groups for elder folk. There were MP surgeries that happened in there. There were advice sessions on money. And it was a place. It was a place actually where people who were lonely or disconnected, and there were many people who didn't have big family links or big friendship groups, to come in and basically find some form of warmth and sociability. So it's very low level, and it didn't have an explicit political agenda. So we didn't have to box tick. And I think it was a centerpiece of the high road for a number of years, entirely run by volunteers, actually. And I think apart from an initial payment from the council to get the rent, it pretty much ran itself. And from there, obviously, it was a kind of basis. It provided the kind of context by which we got public opinion in the area. And over the time we were there, we ran a number of campaigns to represent those local views to people in power.
And how were those sort of councillors that you left behind? What was their reaction to it, Chris? Do you remember?
Yeah, I mean, I think people who sign up for local government, I think it's quite different now, actually, because I think councillors see their role as more like a job. And that was very different back in the 90s. Most of us who were councillors had a day job or were doing something in the day. I was a student, actually, at the time, which actually reinforces how old I was before I got a proper job, but that's another story. So I kind of was still doing a teacher training course to teach in FE. So I had quite a lot of time, and I could kind of devote myself to that. But many people would get off the train at 5 o'clock at night from a day in the city or wherever, and we would go into meetings that started at 6 o'clock, and we would be there the whole evening. I mean, it's a real commitment. And actually, I think there were those people who obviously had a very clear political purpose, who were signed up as kind of, loyal Labour or lifer Conservatives, that kind of thing. But then there are a set of people who I think use the party label or vehicle to represent their community and were perhaps less interested in a national political career, but actually wanted to do good in their immediate zone. And I think those people were probably at times quite interested and possibly at times quite jealous at the agility of a group like SCAG and the fact we could be entirely honest in what we said. I think parties are not honest because they're whipped and, well, part of the Green Party are not, but the political parties are whipped. And a lot of the time, votes are structured around kind of party objectives, and that's fine. Or it may be fine in Parliament, but it's probably harder in local government. But I think you don't get that directness of statement that you get with good community work, where people can tell it like it is. There's no need to apologise for, I suppose, an absolute candour. And where I think it's quite refreshing to talk the language of ordinary people. Local government talks the language of committee reports, which is not the language of everyday people. And I think that's why so many people find it difficult to relate to. And I think probably that's the backstory that leads to our grim context now, where we've got a kind of populist dialogue from the right who say, well, actually, all of this stuff is nonsense. I think their reaction is to a language that is alienating. Their solution, of course, is deeply challenging. But what they're doing is perhaps asking questions that many people have been asking for a long, long time. And certainly I found it liberating not to be on the inside. I quite liked the freedom to kind of wander across portfolios and to do things slightly differently with a set of people that you might not otherwise meet. And that, I think, is really powerful.
Yeah, and I was going to come on to that. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning that there were people there who were, you would have labelled as Tory or perhaps, right wing or whatever at the beginning. Do you feel that the process of engagement enable people to not change sides or positions, but were their sides? Did it all become almost meaningless if people unified against a local issue? How did you see that change? Did you see a change process happening in individuals?
I think it's interesting. Most people, I think, don't define themselves by political kind of ideology or statement. So I think, and I wouldn't now, actually. I think I might have done 30 years ago, but I don't now. So I think what it comes down to is a sense of authenticity on the part of people who come together with a genuine desire. And I think if you're focused on the issue or a development or a project and seeing it through, it's almost irrelevant, actually, whether you voted blue or red or green or yellow in the past. I think it's the commonality around that moment. So it's all about, I guess, an alignment around the common good. And because there is a kind of residential equivalence, that I think is enough in those contexts for people to kind of see some point to it. I mean, obviously people would have disagreements in election times. People might kind of get into that stuff. But in the main, actually across my whole life, very rarely have people talked, apart from people who are real party hacks, and they're a tiny substrata of the population. Apart from those people, most of us just don't occupy that headspace at all. What we want is to make practical change that generates a better quality of life, in most cases in the immediate area that we live. And as I say, SCAG was good at that. And in part because I think the area had a kicking. So we'd lost the library, a really much-loved Carnegie Library had been sold off to a private school. I think that annoyed people of all political colours. And in fact, the most successful campaign I think we ran was to reopen a library in Seven Kings. And we were successful in that regard. It wasn't a Carnegie building. It wasn't a grand Victorian structure. It was a small shop. But that return of a service that had been lost was a symbolically important moment for Seven Kings. And it was a moment of great joy, actually, to be there at the opening. Obviously, the councillors cut the ribbon, and that's fine. And we worked very closely, actually, with the ward councillors in Seven Kings, it has to be said. They were great allies. The MP at the time, Mike Gapes, who was the Labour MP for Ilford South, used to run his surgeries with us. So people were helpful, but I think they knew that we weren't tame in the sense that if we felt that they had adopted a position that we didn't like, we would have no compunction saying, on this one, you're wrong. But I like to think we kept our relations pretty cordial across the piece. That only broke down once, I think, when the new Seven Kings Library was itself a threat. So they opened a new library in the place they closed it, and they tried to close another library a mile down the road. And I mean, that really annoyed people. So we got a small library as compensation for historic wrong. And then another facility became at risk. And what we did there was run a massive campaign to keep both libraries open. And they still are, actually. I think around about 2010, it would be the coalition moment, the austerity moment, when they came in. A lot of libraries closed in London, and we managed to keep both our libraries open by, I think, almost one of the most successful bits of community organisation I've seen, actually, in my many years of doing it. And that was a great unifying moment where literally every section of the population, every civic organisation in Seven Kings and its neighbour Goodmays, signed up to keep the two libraries. And I think the number of people on the petition pretty much exactly matched the number of people that lived in the area. So we had one-on-one, everyone backing that campaign. And the council had to back down. I mean, it was a beautiful meet. Oh God, that sounds like Trump, doesn't it? It was a beautiful moment. But when we had the council meeting at which they stepped back from the closure, the chamber was full. There was cheering across the chamber. And I think it was that sense that we've done something good for the people that live in the place going forward. And those moments are relatively rare, actually, in life.
Yeah, no, absolutely, especially at that level, I think. Now, a lot of what you said reminds me of a book that I know that you're familiar with, Power to the People.
Yeah.
Danny Sriskandarajah. I know that because I saw it on your feed, on your Facebook feed, I think. And there's a little bit there's several actually bits in this that I think that relate directly to what you're saying. But one is, he quotes Robert Putnam from, I think it's Bowling Alone, the author of Bowling Alone. And he says, by taking part in social networks, joiners become more tolerant, less cynical, and more empathetic to the misfortune of others. And would you agree with that statement? It sounds as if you would, but
yeah, I think exactly. I mean, it's a really good book, and I think he tells interesting stories. Actually, it's a very human book, actually, and that isn't always the case with these kind of things. Yeah, I think social capital is important. I think Putnam's an interesting writer. And I think exactly that, what you do by sharing space and breaking bread, often food is a good one, isn't it, where people kind of eat together because they're part of a community activity. You do realise that people's experience, their lived experience, is often quite nuanced and textured and different. And it's not that kind of, it's not the sloganising of the political activists who will often make worthy statements about disadvantage on the part of others, but there's often a lack of authenticity. So what they're talking about is a set of victims. What you're doing in these instances is talking about friends and neighbours. And that, I think, is the moment of empathic truth, as it were. And I think he's caught that very well. So I think that, going back to why do you do this stuff when you might not have been the kind of person that would be expected to, I think it is the fact that you find genuine stories that challenge your reading of the world, and it's often quite modestly done. So it's not a moment of revelation, but it's a small drip feed of what is a more complex world than people often like to paint it. And sadly, of course, in the last 30 years, people have tried to paint things even more simplistically. So, right, wrong, black, white. The sense is the shade of grey is harder to capture. And I think the great thing about community activism is that most of us occupy that grey zone. And if you're in the grey zone and there's a preparedness to listen and tolerate and ask questions, actually, to be inquisitive, those things are very healthy for society.
And I think, as you said, I think one of probably the biggest, I said every podcast, Chris, so viewers may be sick of me saying it, but I do think it's important. I think what the progressives, but not even progressives, people who want to seek change within the communities they're living in, and regionally and nationally as well, we've not been good at telling stories that engage people, or giving a vision of something different, that the world doesn't have to be, our neighborhood doesn't have to be like this, it can be this, and creating a vision of what it can be. Well, was that part of the you mentioned sort of a manifesto, or you alluded to that with SCAG, but was it part of that process, or was it reacting to situations rather than creating visions of a better future?
I think often community stuff is a reaction to bad news, actually. So most of the campaigns that we pick up on, I guess, or we know about, certainly as a journalist, are where people are opposing, I don't know, new developments, or they're looking at the loss of services. But I think in the course of those conversations, because it's very often the case that the model that currently exists won't exist going forward. In the course of those conversations, what you're really looking at are shades of alternative provision or new developments that take maybe an experience in the past and turn it into a new experience. So I guess there is a visioning in the course of that often reactive politics. But I think, again, one of the things we did do with SCAG and its successor, Take Action for Seven Kings, was to do more general listening exercises. So you would ask people to engage some imagination about what an even better place could look like. We started with the notion that there are many good things. So we didn't go into that kind of dark zone where nothing is good, because I think that's often a problem of community groups as well. It's such an apocalyptically bad vision about where we are now that people can't anticipate a positive future. So I think it is about finding a measured response, and also, if you do have a vision, trying to have small steps that move you towards that virtuous place. If it's so grand and if it's so different and distinct from where you are now, I think people find the mind the gap thing really hard. And I think the left often, in that idealism, often paint that picture. There's now and there's perfection, but the bit in the middle is probably where most people are interested in. And I think, yeah, storytelling is absolutely important. We do it much better than we used to. But I think the right, strangely, do it much better than the left, actually, because it's about the purity of thought. And actually what the real world perhaps is more interested in, or those of us who occupy that space, is small incremental movements to achieve something better. Very rarely do people expect, I think, that nirvana will come as a result of some ideological change, and that's the pressure. It comes normally through negotiation, deal making, favours, and luck, actually, in many cases.
Yeah, and you can say that you create the conditions for luck to happen as well, within that dialogue and those conversations, and sometimes difficult conversations. And I think you're right. Often there's no black or white. There's just shades of grey, and it's accepting that, and that that incremental work is absolutely necessary as part of the process to real change, to lasting change. Is SCAG still operating? Do you know, or do you know what happened?
As I say, SCAG kind of, it's weird, isn't it? Kind of after a time, often groups get frustrated with each other, and I think because people have been around for a long time, so that's the other thing. I think it's actually quite good that groups morph into new forms. So what we had, and I can't remember the trigger, actually, it's a long time ago now, why SCAG turned into Task, but I think we ran out of energy. The shop, I think, closed because the money ran out, and there was a feeling that people had just given hours and hours of their time, and I think we took some time out, but because there was a sense actually something was missing. Having walked away, there was a feeling this was rash, and we needed to come back with a more measured and a more, maybe a more grown-up kind of form. So a set of us came back as Take Action for Seven Kings. I think, again, in response to a threat to a piece of public land. But it was a much less engaged group in the sense of running big public meetings, which we did for a long time in SCAG. We were more focused on, planning applications, attending council meetings. So it kind of was more of a grown-up feel, and it didn't necessarily occupy the same space. And as I say, I moved from London at that point. I think Task didn't hang around that much longer, partly because I think some of the active members moved away, and I think some of the members were getting on. There was one particular figure who was an absolute dynamo, who'd run it from the start and was a former trade unionist. He was a market trader from the East End. Absolutely formidable guy. He was probably in his late 60s when he started off, but he didn't appear to be that old. He had huge energy. But by the time we got to, the late, or 2010, he was probably heading for his late 70s and 80s. And I guess he was tired. And I think all of us probably needed to go off and do something else. I moved. I think there was a feeling because of a work change that we didn't have to live in London anymore. And after much searching, because we couldn't find a place we wanted to move to, we came across Hastings, and it was very cheap at the time. The feeling was it was a very, very special kind of place and had the kind of community that would be interesting and arty and fun. So we made a completely rash decision on the back of a job offer to move. It was lunatic, actually, on the sense I got a job in Hastings, and then we just put the house on the market. My wife didn't have a job, the kids didn't have schools. My job started in 4 weeks, so I was commuting between London and here for a long time. On paper, it was completely irrational, but actually, with hindsight, looking back 14 years on, it was a good call, I think.
And am I mistaken in thinking that you also engaged, probably around this time, in community organising training? It was an accredited training scheme, the first in the UK of its kind. Is that right?
You are correct. Yeah, you've got a good memory. So the London Citizens, as they were, Citizens UK, I think now, were a very big community organising player, largely based around organisations, actually, rather than individuals. And they were running, in conjunction with the Geography Department at Queen Mary, University of London, a Masters. And it was the first year. And I mean, again, the gods look down sometimes. I just finished a job at the LSE. I've been there a long time. And I segued literally from that into the Masters full time. So it's a 1-year course, brand new program. And we were, I think, 12 of us. So we were, I guess, human guinea pigs for that course. Brilliant tutors, one of whom now has high national profile, Maurice Glassman, godfather of Blue Labour, obviously, in the national press again after a period out. So he was one of the tutors. An amazing woman called Jane Willis, who I think now is maybe at Exeter, was the other tutor. And it was a masterclass in political organising and the history of American street politics, because a lot of the stuff came from the States. And we were seconded to work with London Citizens in one of their chapters, their term, working on a live community project. And in fact, the Seven Kings Library threat was my dissertation. How do you save a library in London? So I kind of used the theory in real time to apply to a particular scenario happening in my own backyard. It was a brilliant program. I think it lasted for about 4 or 5 years, and I don't think it does now in the form it did. And it may well be that it was a funding issue or people couldn't afford to take the places. But I was lucky to have my place sponsored.
Interesting that you were engaged in the community work, which I wasn't aware of at that time as well, which obviously was useful to your studies, I suppose, and putting that theory into action.
Yeah, but I mean, what was interesting about Citizens, because obviously groups like SCAG and Task were very informal. They weren't charity. In fact, SCAG was a charity, but it ran in a very organic way for good reasons. I think to go into Citizens and to see their chapters and to see the way they organised their listening campaigns, very large meetings, very diverse audiences, but organised around schools, faith communities, trade unions in some cases, mainly faith communities actually, who came together for big assemblies where there would be a resolution proposed and then there would be an acclamation of that resolution. It was a different way of doing politics. And as someone who hadn't been a joiner, it was quite an interesting and alternative take on my gut notion that you work with individuals actually are still there and they're still effective.
You say that's London Citizens who took that approach, or SCAG?
So London Citizens was the host for our work placement. I think they're now Citizens UK because they have people working outside of London, but they've been going since the 90s, I think.
Yeah. So now we're with you in Hastings, and I know that you were involved in a project called the Seven Streets Project. Is that right? That you coordinated?
I mean, when I first came here, there was I did a period working with FE actually, which we don't need to detain ourselves with for the purpose of this exercise. And it was fine, but I came from a university, and I'd assumed FE was like a university. It wasn't, and it was a very different world. The finances of FE are fragile, as many people who work there, I think, could attest. So after a period doing coaching of students and doing some teaching in the social sciences, which I didn't particularly want to do, actually, I kind of had a period where I was kind of looking for something to kind of keep me amused or to pay the bills. And there was a little job advertised, and it was, I think, literally in the local paper, or it may have been in one of the online papers, and it was for a part-time community organizer. And of course, I just finished this first program at QMUL. The job was down the road to me in St Leonard's, and it was an 18-month fixed-term role. I think it was 2 days a week, and it was to work with a set of streets that I think were widely seen as kind of ungovernable. I think someone I met at the time said, this is an area that's, completely chaotic and has got multiple issues. And what we want is to try and cohere people in this space and to try and, organise a better future. So I kind of applied for it. And I'd only lived here a short time, so I hadn't really spent a lot of time in St Leonard's. I'd been working at the college, and it was hard work, actually. So I kind of went for the interview, not necessarily expecting to do that well, but I knew I had in my quiver this kind of course that was quite unique. And I got the job. I mean, it was a lovely interview. And sometimes you go into a room and you kind of think, I'd like the job. And you leave after the interview thinking, actually, I hope I don't get it. In this case, there was a real sense of value in applying, although the money wasn't great. It was only part-time. And it's one of those moments when you get the call back later that afternoon, you see the name on the phone of the person who was interviewing you. You're just thinking, oh, my God, I really want this to be a yes. And it was a yes. And I remember I was literally thrown in. I think when I got the message, it was like, there's a meeting tomorrow night. Can you come in and kind of observe this meeting? So it was a real rush moment, and I kind of didn't have anything on, so I started quite quickly. But it's probably one of the most powerful things I've done in my working life. And what made it powerful was it was such a contained space, 7 streets, literally, a very significant, in size terms, Victorian housing, most of which have been carved up into flats, bedsits. Very few single occupancy houses existed. And on every index of multiple deprivation, it was up there as a super output area. And a bid had been made to the People's Lottery to develop an ecology of local support and a network that would represent the people who lived in the 7 streets. It's quite a complex bid, and it was written by someone who I think went off and ended up teaching at Goldsmiths. But it anticipated a set of kind of almost road committees and road captains. It was quite formalist. And obviously there was a very tight timeline. I think People's Lottery only give 1 tranche of money. So the sense is there was quite a big ask in terms of doing things. And I was the only kind of paid worker. There was a board of people that were helping to structure the project, including one of the local councillors who became a good friend. And I think what was very evident, and this is true of community work, that the script and the reality often don't align. And I think we initially opened up, we had a shop given to us, seems to be a running story, give a community group a shop. And then, you do stuff in it. And we opened up on a Thursday morning, and all we really had was some tea bags, a cafetiere, some milk and biscuits. Actually, again, it's an understory of community work. Those are the key tools. And we invited people to come in. And it took time. You realise on an 18-month project, actually, it takes time to get going. And what was very clear was when we started talking about road committees and would you be interested in signing up for this kind of stuff, most people actually would rather run a mile. There was a real sense of, who are you? What are you doing? What's the purpose for this? And it was clear that vision would need re-elocution, and that obviously we want to get people involved and we want networks, but maybe a more informal approach was necessary. And I think over the course of the project, we probably knocked on every door in the 7 streets. And initially, we spent a lot of time saying, we're not the council, we're not the police, we're not social services, we're not the probation service, we're not here to kind of dib you in or whatever. And we didn't have an agenda, actually. So unlike many projects where there is a very explicit agenda that you sign up to and then you tick those boxes, what we actually wanted to do is pure community organising, was listen to what people wanted for those immediate streets. What would make life better round here now? And how do we achieve it? And what are you prepared to do? I guess are the questions. But literally, we spent ages trying to convince people we weren't run by professional bureaucracy, because people were very suspicious in those 7 streets that they'd been promised so much by the politicians, the council, the housing associations, and that, again, there was a mismatch. There was a distance between them. And we did a lot of work actually trying to kind of represent people's voices to those professional bureaucracies, to say they don't kind of believe what you're saying, and how can we act upon their concerns? So I think we started off, it was something called a doodle day. We didn't have a formal kind of launch or anything like that. It was a Saturday. We put bunting up in the street. The centre was open. We had quite a lot of artists. It was an area that actually was marked by having a significant number of people with a creative background, whatever their income, and quite mixed levels of education, actually, but often people who dropped out for whatever reason. So it was quite a complex area. When people painted the picture of kind of multiple deprivation, it might not be quite as people imagined. And ethnically, it was probably more diverse than other parts of Hastings. So we did the Doodle Day, and people came up with their post-its of what they'd like to see. And interestingly, because this was not in the head of the originators of the project, public safety was one of the key themes, that people actually felt unsafe on the streets. They felt the police weren't visible. And it was interesting, in the course of the time we ran, I think we had a number of drug deaths, often middle-aged guys in bedsits, and it's often midweek as well. You'd hear the ambulances, and they'd come, and you'd see some person, possibly without friends or family, often in quite a bleak place, being removed from the place. And we had a couple of instances where I think international students were beaten up. So it wasn't a particularly unsafe place, although you'd always check when you locked your bike that you'd done it properly. But that was the catalyst, I think, for one of the most kind of powerful moments from the 7 Streets project, which is when there was a public meeting called with the police commissioner for Sussex, the MP at the time, who was Amber Rudd, Home Secretary, the council leader at the time, and a set of local residents, and the police chief for Hastings, because there was a concern that there were too many instances of upset for comfort. And I don't think I'll ever forget this meeting as long as I kind of maintain my kind of faculties. We had about 50 people in our community shop. One of the things we said, actually, one of our, I suppose, our mantras was doing good, not do gooding. And we wouldn't speak for people if they could speak for themselves. So the sense in a public meeting was, we do not need to say the people of the 7 Streets think this as a paid worker. What we'd often do is work with people to, if they needed to rehearse what they wanted to say, or they wanted to have a practice run, we give them that. But the feeling is it's much better coming from them than someone who didn't live in the 7 Streets. I didn't. I cycled in. I lived a mile or so away. I came to love the 7 Streets, but bottom line is I went home to actually a quite leafy road a mile away, and it would have been quite wrong for me to speak for those audiences. Yeah. But in the course of this meeting, so we had all the grandees sitting in front of the meeting, and the police guy opened the meeting by saying, I'd like to say one thing to the people of St Leonard's. You've never had it so good. And I've never seen, in the context of this kind of set of upsets in the immediate preceding days, I thought the room was going to erupt. I've never seen anything like it, because the British really don't do that kind of thing. But there was outrage. And I think Amber Rudd, the police commissioner, there was that look of shock that how could you say this kind of thing before people had been invited to say their opinion. And in fact, out of that came the opening of a new police hub. So such was the feeling manifested in the room that the authorities, at a time of cutback, actually opened a hub, because the feeling was these guys have been ignored and forgotten. And I think that's people power actually manifested in a very clear way. And often I speak to the councillor who was there. He said, gosh, I've never seen anything like it. He's been a councillor for 30 years. That meeting was unlike anything he'd seen, and unlike anything I'd seen. And it was that one incendiary opening statement. No listening. It was clumsy and it was error. The guy's not a bad guy, but what a foolish way to start. And it united the politicians at the end in pursuit of a different way. Interestingly, also, I mean, Amber Rudd, very busy woman, obviously a Conservative MP. This part of the world wasn't particularly Conservative. We asked her, because she'd come into the shop, will you run your surgeries in our shop? It's not a natural place, but we'll make you welcome. You've got a private room, you can chat to people. And she did, to her great credit, actually. We had people queuing for the MP surgeries, and really unlikely cocktail, actually, of people who would be not expected to get on. Her casework team were phenomenal, actually, and that's not a party political endorsement. It was just she was very good at doing casework, and she was very good at working with the generality of residents in the area. And it's that moment where you had some people who were genuinely hard up coming in with their gifts to give to someone who wasn't, because they were very grateful with the quality of the service they got. And I guess that makes the point also that people in areas that often have challenge deserve the very best. In fact, they need extra compensation. So when advocacy happens, rather than a kind of well-meaning kind of attempt to do okay, what they really need is excellence. And I think we were very grateful that Amber moved her surgery regularly into the 7 streets. And I think that was one of the defining moments. And the other thing that I remember very clearly from that period was we had a problem with discarded needles. There was a big drug use issue, and needles were just being dumped in the road where kids played. Many people didn't have gardens. And we tried to get them removed from the public authorities. And the sense was, well, we don't really pick up needles because they're dangerous. And you say, but okay, we get that. But the kids are playing often without shoes on around the needles. So can we have the kit to do the collecting? And that took a phenomenal amount of time, actually, to convince the public authority to give us the bags, the boxes, the disposal things, to get rid of the impedimenta of drug use. But in the end, we managed to get this kit from the authorities. And every Thursday morning, and it was a regular thing, 11 o'clock, we would trundle off with a team of community volunteers around the whole of the 7 streets, and we do a litter pick. And it was good in itself because it picked up stuff that had been discarded. But what it gave us was a natural vehicle and a moving vehicle, like a travelling circus, to talk to people who might come out of their house to say thank you, or they might come out occasionally to barrack us initially. You know, why are you doing that? There's no point. It's just going to be back next day. But over time, and it goes back to your point of a few minutes ago, unlikely people who initially, when they met, made judgments about each other, became best friends in the course of trundling this trolley around the streets. And over time, we had, I think Amber had done it. We had the Labour wannabe MP for Hastings joined us. The local councillor every Thursday put on his jeans. He only ever wears jeans when he did the pickup. And we went out and we did the collection. Took about 2 hours. And then we'd all come back and we'd share tea and cake or whatever together. And that moment, I think, was simple. And people say, well, what's so important about it? What was important, I think, was, one, it thanked people for their effort, and 2, it allowed for that kind of debrief thing that goes on. And it in turn led to other kind of activities and projects. We ran it was probably a very anarchic kids club, but it was a kids club for people that wouldn't become Scouts and Cubs. They wouldn't join the uniformed organisations. So we ran that in the local church. We had good connections with Christ Church, excellent church over the road to us. And it was, it was a safe haven for kids who probably would have just been at home, or maybe kind of sitting alone at home if their parents were working. And that ran for a long period of time with a group of us who coordinated that. And that's quite a responsibility for a voluntary group. We had people running our front desk who came in from an employment retraining scheme. I don't think they'd ever had paid work, or certainly not in living memory. They'd never been trusted with a set of keys and a keypad number. Linda and Peter, both of them unfortunately not with us anymore, but they ran the office as volunteers, actually with a rod of iron. I feel quite, it's quite emotional. Linda had a particularly hard life, actually, but to be given the responsibility of being our receptionist, I think for her was, it's like doing an MBA for someone who's done an LSE economics degree. And it was about trust. It was about saying to people, we're not going to kind of infantilize you. It's not about, token roles. We trust you to do this. We trust you to feedback. We trust you to be our ambassadors. And it was, a phenomenal ride for 18 months. And it caught the zeitgeist in the sense St Leonard's was changing a great deal. You've been down recently with an old friend of both of us, and I think you saw what is quite a fashionable location now. It was very, very different when you, I think, lived in the locality back in the when, and when I rocked up in 2013 when we were running this project. So the backdrop to a lot of that activity was people coming into our shop on Thursdays. They drive in from London or Brighton or wherever, and they'd ask which are the roads that it's nicest to buy in. And there was one road that people kind of resisted for a long time. But there was clearly that movement of kind of increasing fashionability for St Leonard's. But the people we work with operated outside of that dialogue. And it was one of the most privileging things I've done because it was so hard to read. And the script that we had, that ward, those road captains, never happened and would never happen. But what we had was eyes and ears in every street. And we had newsletters going out regularly and the most unlikely set of distributors. And I think that was the heartening thing, that it wasn't the usual suspects.
Absolutely. And one can't help but wonder what's happened to those eyes and ears now. You said that St Leonard's, I saw it. I was down there with you about 3-4 months ago, and my goodness, has it changed from when I was there. I was there about 2009-10, I suppose. That's one of the problems, isn't it, in terms of community work, that the scene shifts all the time, particularly for people when you're working with people from, who don't have much income. And I wonder whether those houses, those 7 roads, are they now no longer houses of multiple occupation, or are they perhaps being turned into more salubrious flats that those people can't afford? Have you got any feel for that at all in terms of what's happened?
I think that movement from, say, bedsits to larger apartments probably has happened. The houses are super large, so it's quite rare to see a 4-story house in single occupancy still. But what I think you've seen is whole floors be taken over as flats. You've seen the colour wash come in. Just the range of colour now, if you walk along the roads, the stucco is multicoloured. It used to be kind of, there's a friend of mine who calls it slum landlord's cream. And actually, it's not so much cream as they used to be. And I think our former community shop is now a gallery. And there are lots of galleries. I think Central St Leonard's ward, I read somewhere, has more artists than any other electoral ward in Britain outside London. So, but they were always there. And I think people confuse it. They often think that artists mean wealth. Actually, artists are often very poor. What it was a very permissive and enabling place. And I think what you now have is an audience of creatives who are paid to do it, who've moved in, because it's got that kind of Shoreditch by the Sea, Dalston by the Sea feel. Having said that, there are still vast numbers of people who are pretty hard up. And there are many people who've lived there through good times and bad times. And there are a number of people who don't live there anymore because their bedsit's been sold on and turned into a flat. So I think a lot of people have moved further down the coast, actually. I think I work in Eastbourne now, and a number of people who were helpers on the Seven Streets project, people from the bedsits, they still come up to me and say, have you moved to Eastbourne? And actually, a lot of them live in Seaside Eastbourne now. So areas change, I think. And strangely enough, I did a talk probably about 2 months ago in Seaside Eastbourne, where they were asking about what happened in the Seven Streets project 10 years ago, and the same message is the one that I kind of shared, which is that you've got to get organised. If you wait for the public authorities to do it, you'll wait for a long time, particularly now because the numbers of people working in the public sector are much lower than they were even in 2013. Councillors are pressured and the money ain't there. But you've got to make a noise, and vocal places get attention, and vocal places tend to be affluent. You need to make sure that your vocality is evident, but also you don't just tell people what's wrong with the place, because people often get that. You've got to come up with solutions that are community driven, and you've got to try and work with as many people who are on side to deliver those small incremental changes that give people the confidence and the hope that stuff won't be the same in another decade's time. So that's Eastbourne at the moment, which may give rise to a variant on the Seven Streets project. But I think, there are different groups now working in St Leonard's. It's probably one of the most social capital rich places. Hastings generally is actually. It's got a massive voluntary and community sector. And that represents, I think, both the fact that it's got a strong heart, but it's pretty well networked, actually, in many ways.
And you've got, I think, a Green Party council at the moment, have you?
That's quite recent, yeah. I mean, it used to be pretty red, actually, and the Greens got a seat 4 years ago. They, I think, now are the majority party in Hastings Borough Council. They certainly hold both seats in Central St Leonard's. And actually, again, it's interesting that you talk to the councillors there, and those stories, because both of them, I think, weren't around necessarily in political roles at the point the Seven Streets project were going on. They've heard the stories because people say, we remember when this stuff happens. And I guess one of the challenges with community is, although I was only doing, a couple of days a week, although in practice you end up doing far more, to have someone who can kind of coordinate and elocute things is really helpful. And when there isn't someone who's got the time and the space and the facility to do that, it does rely on that informal network, and that can be more fragile. And I think that's one of the problems, that you do need someone sometimes to kind of tweak the system and make it work most effectively. But I mean, there's a massive clean-up network in Hastings and St Leonard's now. So it works across the town. It's entirely volunteer-led. And that makes its mark in very clear ways. And I think one of the Green councillors actually found her political voice through the clean-ups, actually. So it's interesting that she came in from the community to the inside, which is the reverse of my 90s experience of going in expecting to have influence and to be able to make significant change, and actually getting quite frustrated with the slow timelines and the kind of bureaucratic approach, and deciding to go out and do it on the outside.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, a lot of what you say really chimes with the Sustainable Development Goals. I think that they're useful as a framework, a reference point almost. And obviously sort of cutting through all of that is leave no one behind, which is a sort of a cross-cutting theme in the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that, people don't have to follow them slavishly, but nevertheless, I think that it's, as you've alluded to, poverty is complex, and it's there are many, many different issues that make up an experience of poverty for somebody. And I think what you've spoken to today is how, if through listening and engaging with people at the local level, you can make a big difference. And, I think it can make a big difference to how people in the town relate to the place that they live in. And with each other as well. I was wondering, Chris, whether or not your experience as a journalist or would you call yourself a community journalist, or has that played a role at all? Has your community work experience played a role in the way that you undertake your journalism?
Yeah, I think it did. I mean, I think it does. I think the term is citizen journalist these days, which, I think that's what people, who do stuff for free. Actually, most journalists do stuff for free now. That is what we're called. But I think my journalism started actually when I kind of did a little blog post for Hastings Online Times. And it was really just to kind of tell the story of the project. And it was I guess, a people rather than a process-driven story. So I wrote a couple of things for them, and then over time I ended up doing broader coverage. So I used to cover the elections. I'm a bit of a kind of elections geek in terms of the numbers and the swings and things. So I ended up doing the election commentary every year. I ended up, as you mentioned earlier, I enjoy eating out and kind of those kind of things. So I ended up doing the food reviews and shopping. So, yeah, I think definitely the experience of listening and building relationship. So taking time, slow writing almost, does inform the stuff I do now. I very recently have been asked to edit the community pages of Hastings Independent Press. So that's very much about hearing stories from the front line in parts of the borough I don't necessarily know about. And obviously we receive an awful lot of stuff from people, but the really powerful stuff is when people who don't necessarily form part of established groups or charities, who have their formal press release stuff, and that's fine. It's when people send in a piece independently, and I think we had something the other week from the Men's Shed movement, the guys who come together to do repairs, have conversations. We've got some really good stuff from a group called Mr. Hastings and Mr. St. Leonard's, which is all about well-being for blokes in the town, and they're doing amazing work in terms of getting men to talk to each other via a vehicle called Talk Club. And Hastings this year will be part of the Baton of Hope suicide awareness campaign that happens biannually. So stuff that's coming in from people like that is always interesting. But to do it justice, you need to speak to the people who author it. You need to meet them. You need to construct carefully put together pieces. Otherwise, I think you devalue those set of experiences. So, yeah, sometimes less is more. It takes longer to get this stuff out. But I think the community journalism is probably, I don't do much activism at all now. I'm involved in the book festival. It's a kind of, grown-up thing. But I think the journalism is probably the kind of continuing thread all the way back to SCAG in the mid-90s through to the Seven Streets experience and beyond here. So yeah, I guess there is a golden thread, and I think the writing at the moment, maybe the reflection on how all this stuff works, is where my head's at the moment. I might put something together in a more formal written sense, but it would be stories, I think, rather than grand theory, because I think some kind of handbook maybe of stuff that you can use as a kind of launch pad, almost a kind of an A to Z guide, because I think that's often quite hard when people start doing community work. How do you get started? How do you run an event even? Why would you know that unless you've done it before?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's no real template for this sort of thing. It's experiential sort of led, really. But I mean, it's nice you've drawn that thread from Seven Kings through to the Seven Streets, and then and then your journalism. And I know that also you're a big journaler as well, in the sense that you do it. You write a daily journal. You reflect upon your day.
Well, yeah, I think it's nice. It's quite nice, isn't it, to end the day, I think, with just 3 or 4 bullet points that often pick up on small pleasures. I think those things become more important in an age that is difficult and it's turbulent. And we've seen over the last week, shocking things going on. So I think to capture moments of goodness, moments that could be improved, those are worthwhile things. I think to structure the day, normally, that's what I do, come up with a very, very basic kind of list of stuff that might be worth achieving. And a friend of mine introduced me to journaling, ages ago now. And I was very cynical initially. I thought, I've never kept a diary in a formal sense. But that kind of bulleted focusing point and the kind of the rigor of it, I've actually found refreshing. So I've kind of given up on all the other note-taking, and it all kind of now forms part of a journaling regime. So yeah, it works for me. I mean, other people, I guess, do it in different ways.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, to reflect upon, key things that have happened during the day, or the things that you hope to come out of the day. We're quite keen on sort of the importance of difficult to put it really, but consciousness in terms of people really looking at their relationship to others, the place they live in. And it seems to me that journaling is a good way of doing that. You know, it's a structured time, but it doesn't have to necessarily follow a tight structure, does it?
No. And I mean, some people are kind of, quite formulaic in their journaling. I'm not, I'm a free-form journaler. Just because I can't do formulae, I'm not good at. But I think it is useful. And one of the things I started doing recently, because you meet an awful lot of people, is just capturing. It's very good to write down the names of people. It's very easy to forget them. So who they are, a little bit about that backstory. So when you encounter people, and in small towns you do it all the time, you've got that continuing narrative to go on. And it's quite nice to expand your networks, I think. And it's one of the points people often say, well, I don't know anyone. And I think when you begin to do those recordings, you realise actually that you know more people than you think, and they're probably more diverse than you imagine. So I think that's quite an optimistic thing to do. And I think the art, particularly when you get older, is to try and talk to people outside one's tribe. It's very easy, isn't it, to get into the old ways and to look back. And we all do it. It's part of being part of the saga generation, isn't it? Before you buy the side entry bath, you spend your time talking about how good the 80s were. And you think, we were doing it the other week with some people, and they said, well, actually, it's 40 years ago. It's not yesterday. So I think you do have to keep yourself fresh in some ways. And the journaling, I think, helps me do that. And probably the arts, again, I do a lot of stuff in the arts. Because there's always change and it's dynamic. I think that keeps you on your toes as well. So I think to be culturally involved is good. Surprising, actually, how many politicians are not, actually. I think it's one of the reasons they can often be quite dull, because they don't do stuff outside of their ideological preference. I think it's good to read stuff that comes from other quarters, much easier than it used to be in an age of podcasts and blogs. So I think the art is to challenge your own assumptions and to listen, even though at times you might not want to.
Yeah, no, I think that's important, and I think to an extent that does come with age, in the sense that those political stances one takes, or the various prejudices one has, you kind of get tired of them, and it is good to listen to other people's viewpoints. You may not agree with it, but there may be elements of that viewpoint that chime or make you think, or. So I think, it's been a fascinating conversation, Chris. We could probably go on all afternoon, I've no doubt.
But let's spare the watchers and the listeners.
Well, indeed, yes. Well, no, I don't think so. In this case, for once, Chris, I wouldn't say that, in terms of our conversations, perhaps. I think it's been really illuminating and really interesting. And I think sort of listening is a large part, a thread that runs through all of this. And I think that's a valuable thing. And I'm not so sure how genned up you were on the Sustainable Development Goals when I invited you. I know I sent you some material, but I think that the value of having you on as a sort of not as a representative of an organisation, but as an individual in this respect, in this conversation, the value of that, you've given us a very human story about engagement at a community level, and I thank you for it, and I thank you for your honesty in it. And it would be lovely to catch up with you at some point also to see if there's any new developments, which I'm sure inevitably, given the engagement you have with people in your community, there will be quite a few stories and interesting issues for us to explore. So thank you again. Thank you for your time. And let's hope we can meet up again in the future.
Well, honestly, thank you for having me. I hope it was interesting at some level and people can kind of play with some of those ideas. And yeah, do come down to Hastings again soon.
Undoubtedly, it's one of my favourite places to come. So I'll see you soon, Chris, and thank you very much indeed.
Thanks ever so much. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
That was great, Chris.
Is that okay?
Yeah, it was fantastic.